Joining me now is best-selling author of groundbreaking works, including his latest, The War on the West, Douglas Murray. Douglas, I'm keen to get your thoughts on the major escalation in the Middle East with Iran's direct attacks against Israel. But first, the vice presidential debate was on yesterday, and again we had the moderators trying to be participants. But despite that, J.D. Vance put in a solid performance that even the New York Times called dominant.
Well, you've got to pretend that Donald Trump didn't deliver rising take-home pay, which of course he did. You've got to pretend that Donald Trump didn't deliver lower inflation, which of course he did. And then you've simultaneously got to defend Kamala Harris's atrocious economic record.
Douglas, what are your thoughts on the debate and how much impact, if any, will it have on the election?
Well, you know, the received wisdom, Rita, is that VP picks don't have that much influence on the race. That I don't think is actually true. I think they do have more influence than is often said. But it's also often said that the VP debates don't have all that much influence. And again, I don't think that's the case on this occasion. This was the first time for the American public to see J.D. Vance and Tim Walz going head-to-head and to judge both men. I have to say, I mean, I think that it's pretty clear and that the New York Times was for once right. I think the evening was J.D. Vance's. He seemed to be on top of all of the issues that came up. He was respectful. He was sharp. He was likable and much more. And Tim Walz was, to use one of his own favorite words, well, he was weird. He looked all the time as if he had walked in from somewhere else, from some other set or some other job application. It looked like somebody who turned up for the wrong job interview and then was rather startled to discover it was the vice presidential debate. And of course, he had the worst moment of the evening when he was asked about why he lied about being in China at the time of Tiananmen Square. And he replied by saying, I think the American public, know that I grew up in a house with a family among Americans. And, we used to have food on the table, and we had a table and food. And he just, I mean, even the biased moderators did end up, after about what felt like 48 hours of this waffle, did end up saying, yeah, but what about your claim that you were in Tiananmen Square? And he did that great Clintonism. I think a word that wasn't in the language until the Clintons, which was, I misspoke. And, I mean, I suppose it could happen to any of us, Rita. I sometimes claim to have been at the D-Day landings. I often claim to have been there waving the Titanic off as she set sail. It's easily done. And it's just, if you do catch me doing it, Rita, I just misspoke, that's all.
It's an innocent mistake, and I know you grew up in a household with a family and you had your dinners on tables with four legs, so it's all tables. And now you are focused on the facts, the consequential issues of this debate and election, but others in the media are fixated on other things like J.D. Vance's beard. And I'm not talking about Teen Vogue here, but Politico, which has published this. Yes, Vance's beard matters. Vance is the first White House wannabe to wear facial hair in 80 years. They go on to say how masculine beards are, and I quote, that can be positive to some, reading as strength and competence, but to others, especially women, it can be negative, conveying aggression and opposition to feminist ideals. And this isn't the first time Politico has published a piece about J.D. Vance's facial hair. There was this in July with the headline, yes, J.D. Vance's beard matters, here's why. I am keen on your thoughts, Douglas.
It's very strange, isn't it? I mean, it suggests that anything that looks like masculinity and competence would put off women. I have to say, I think the only women would think that are ones with pretty big beards themselves, quite frankly. I don't think that most women find. I don't think most women find men having hair to be off-putting. I don't actually think, contra Politico and these other rather sexist publications, actually, that women are disturbed by competence. This is just the extraordinary sort of demonstration that we've seen for a long time of the way in which, frankly, people keep on wanting to make these elections about things other than the issues. And whenever the Republicans have been accused of doing that, the Democrat media says that's because they don't have anything to run on. They're out of ideas. I would have said that at the point that you're having to talk about J.D. Vance's beard and how it might put off non-bearded women, you're really in the sticks because frankly, there was a lot more that came out of the vice presidential debate, and there should be a lot more coming out of it, because America, like Australia and other Western democracies, faces huge problems. It faces immigration crisis. It faces financial crises. It faces international crises. And the fact is, I'm afraid that just as we have a lot of people in the political class who are just not up to dealing with these things, so we have a lot of people in the legacy media class who are so unable to actually work out what's going on in the world, in the economy, and much more, that all they can do is zoom in on facial hair, and it's their fault, not J.D. Vance's.
Now let's turn our minds to the escalating conflict in the Middle East, with Israel hitting targets in Beirut, hitting Hezbollah strongholds. Yesterday we saw Iran launch around 200 missiles at Israel, some of which struck Israeli airfields. Israel has promised to hit back Iran with precision and power. President Joe Biden is talking about reintroducing sanctions on Iran, but he has ruled out supporting an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear sites. How do you see the US's support of Israel and what we can expect to see from Israel next?
First of all, when Donald Trump left office, the mullahs in Tehran were begging him to lift the sanctions because they weren't able to do anything, and at home they were in real trouble. And when Joe Biden came into office, of course, he did lift many of those sanctions, and he gave a huge cash bonanza to the revolutionary Islamic government in Tehran. It's only because they've had this cash bonanza that they can afford to continue to arm these colonialist armies like Hamas in Gaza, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthi militias in Yemen. It's only because of the cash bonanza that the mullahs have had that they're able to do all of these things. It's a little late in the day now for Joe Biden to talk about turning off the spigot in his last few days in office. I wish he would, but I bet he won't. As for the actual retaliation, I'm sorry, we've been here before. Some months ago, when hundreds and hundreds of rockets were fired from Iranian territory, from the Iranian government and its forces at Israel, that was the Israelis were told by Joe Biden famously that they should keep the win because an international force managed to shoot down almost all of those rockets. Well, this is another occasion when they've done it. First of all, by the way, it's a sign of the mullahs' weakness. Their forces have been decimated in their Hamas forces. Their Hezbollah forces have been decimated in Lebanon, including their murderers who not only murder Israelis, but murdered 241 American servicemen in 1983 in the Marine Beirut barracks bombing. So once again, Israel has been doing the work that America should have done in getting those terrorists. The Houthis in Yemen are discovering quite fast that if you launch rockets at Israel, they'll do something back at you. And now the Iranian revolutionary government is having to do it itself because its terror proxies have been being wiped out one by one in the last year. And so they think they can dare to do this. My suggestion should be that if you send ballistic missiles into another country, that country has the right to respond. And Israel should respond with the full force that its government and military believe it should respond with. And I would hope that America and any other country would do likewise. You can't tell me, nobody can tell me, that if hundreds of ballistic missiles have been fired into Australia or Great Britain or Canada or America in the last couple of days that we would listen to an ally telling us, don't do anything back. Sorry, no, too late for that. Time the mullah's got a lesson closer to home.
And I do wonder whether the reality is that even if Israel do eliminate Iran's proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, until there's regime change in Iran, unless there's real pressure applied on Iran, that we're still going to have this issue continue. Israel's going to continue to be under threat from whatever group Iran funds
the whole
next.
region. And the
Just
whole
quickly,
region.
I want to... Absolutely, and it's beyond Israel, absolutely. How do you see Qatar's role, not just in this conflict in the Middle East, but the enormous influence it has in the West? And how does such a tiny country, only around 300,000 odd citizens, most of the population there are expatriates and migrant workers, how has such a tiny country managed to have this profound influence in the West?
Well, you know, with Qatar, it's just money. That's all. Just money. That's Qatar. That's his only virtue. And as you say, Rita, it's a few 100,000 people sucking off the teats of the royal family, who themselves just enrich themselves and, of course, live lives of enormous luxury. Otherwise, as you mentioned, there's this slave class that the slave state of Qatar keeps there. And that's the country. They've managed to do a significant amount of buying up in the West, in Britain, universities like King's College London, in America, formerly serious Ivy League colleges and much more. And if you ask where a lot of the hatred and bigotry and racism of the last year has come from, it's Qatar doing this, buying up influence abroad. I would suggest that people turn this around. Whether you like it or not, in the last 2 years, since Putin invaded Ukraine, the international community managed to snap sanctions and really pretty heavy-handed in many ways, sanctions against almost anyone associated with Vladimir Putin. They seized oligarchs' yachts and houses and much more abroad. Well, I would suggest it's high time, since the terrorist sponsoring slave state of Qatar has been wreaking its own mini form of havoc, mini compared to their friends in Tehran, across the region and the wider world. We make it clear, actually, we aren't going to be bought, and they're the vulnerable ones here. And I hope that that is made clear, and it should be. I'd like to see them, like the Revolutionary Islamic government in Tehran, strangled and throttled by sanctions and more, because they have got away with buying us up at too cheap a price for too long, and I hope it changes.
Before you go, October 7 anniversary is days away, the first anniversary of the terrorist attacks launched by Hamas. And here in Australia, there will be anti-Israeli protests held on October 7, taking place shamefully. They expect to see terrorist flags, the flags of Hezbollah, for example, flying in Melbourne and Sydney. This is the worst casualty attack against the Jewish population since the Holocaust. And yet we're going to have people, Douglas, marching against Israel, the only Jewish state, on that day. And I do wonder about the left's unholy alliance with Islamist forces and how much of a genuine threat it is. Do you see it, as I do, as a threat to Western civilization?
You know, Rita, when I was in Australia recently and saw you, I saw these protesters in Sydney and Melbourne. They're a world away from this aspect of the world, a total world away. Australia has suffered some terror attacks in recent years, most noticeably against its citizens in Bali. But these people marching on the streets of Australian cities, the Australian public should know who these people are. They're terrorists, and they're terrorist sympathizers. They're sympathizing and supporting exactly the same people as the people who massacred the Australian holidaymakers in Bali. These are sick people, and I've got a message for them. They're also losing. They are losing. The people whose flags they're going to wave in great Australian cities are the flags of organizations that are going into the dust as we speak. These people will look back on this in 10 years' time with about as much pride as a group of neo-Nazis in the 1950s waving a swastika. Hamas is nearly gone. The Houthis are almost gone. Hezbollah's almost gone in its entirety. The idea that you would have these losers and terrorist sympathizers in cities across Australia doing this, I tell them, they are on the losing side. Most of their friends are gone already. They're admiring dead murderers. They should think on that.
They certainly should think on that. Douglas Murray, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Pleasure as always.